So it's the spring of the year. The battles that were fought against these other mercenary forces had apparently carried them down into the late fall, into what in that part of the world is generally the rainy season when nobody wants to go and fight a battle. And so they waited out. The Ammonites, quaking in their boots, knowing that now they've been abandoned by all of these that they had hired to help them out, and knowing that they're going to be facing the wrath of David because they started this whole conflict in the first place, coming around in the spring. But they wait through these months. Finally, the early spring rains subside. This would be the time when kings would customarily resume hostilities if there is an ongoing conflict. Sometimes people read this and think that routinely kings just go out gratuitously for battle every spring, and that's not quite the sense of it. In this case, there was an ongoing conflict, and both sides are kind of biding their time until the time for such a conflict could properly be resumed. What is left is a mop-up operation. Based on what's happened so far, there is no possible way that the Ammonites can be successful in this conflict. David has just beaten off massively more powerful forces than the Ammonites by themselves represent. And they know that all things being equal, they don't have a chance. They don't have a prayer to any of their gods to make it out of this in one piece. And David sends Joab in order to pick up this, what amounts to a mop-up operation. The mercenaries have been defeated. Edom to the south, as well as Moab off to the east, have been defeated, and now Ammonites are all that are left. Ammon is on the east side of the Jordan. It's a little north of Moab. It had been, as we saw earlier, on friendly relationships with David, but this young buck, Hanun, the son, of course, as sometimes is the case, is bucking, kind of spoiling for a fight, and so it brings us to this situation. We hear that David remained in Jerusalem. I know that many times commentators on this subject fasten on that and say, there's the whole problem. David should have been out there with his army, and that case could certainly be made. However, David knew this was going to be a siege, probably a protracted siege, and it wouldn't be unusual to send the general of your armies to go and engage in siege warfare, at least for the time being. A siege could last several months, and David had other stuff to do. It wasn't as if this required his immediate presence for months on end in a siege situation on the battlefield. So I'm going to give David a bit of a break at this one. But at the same time, the very fact that the author mentions it, David remained in Jerusalem, does create a little bit of foreboding, doesn't it? You just get this feeling that there's more to that than just a little kind of innocuous detail to the story, and as it turns out, that's the case. David had been very successful, and I really think more going to the point of what's happening here is not so much that David remained in Jerusalem, but that David was really kind of riding high over the just unmistakable display of success that he had recently experienced. And I think in his heart he knew this was God's doing. He knew this wasn't just that he was that smart, that good as he was. There had to be more to it. So I think probably in his best moments he recognized that. But still, too much success can go to your head. One commentator said, this is the huge risk of too much success, repeated countless times in human history. And I think probably if we dig down a little deeper, that's really kind of the story here. David just a little bit too confident, and somehow it sets him up for the fall that comes when a man thinks he stands. And that seems to have been the case with David. So it happened one afternoon that David rose from his bed, walked on the roof of the king's house, saw a woman bathing who was very beautiful. This is not saying that David had retired for the night, gone to bed, and now was up with insomnia at midnight. It's not that kind of thing. It was typical to take a siesta in the middle of the day. I've always thought that's a wonderful idea. I love it, and I've as I've retired, I've sort of made that part of my daily routine. I just think it's a wonderful concept. And so David, probably taking a little siesta. Now he's up, he's conducted a little bit of business, and it's pushing toward the evening, And in the cool of the evening in the ancient Near East, it was common to go to the roof of your house. They were always built flat, and they were actually designed to be a place of some, casual entertainment, some reprieve, some quiet at the end of the day. That's what they were set up for. And so David is out there, and what he's doing at this point would be quite common, quite typical at that particular time in history. The houses had flat roofs, but of course we can understand David's house was probably stood a little taller than the rest. He is the king after all, and this is a very nice house that was built with cedar that was imported from Phoenicia, and so he has a nice place, and he's looking out on the other houses. Remember, David's house is inside what's called the citadel, what David called the city of David. That doesn't refer to Jerusalem as such, but to a fortress area inside the city that had been specially designed by the original Jebusites who had lived there as a kind of place of protection, even if Jerusalem happened to be invaded. And David lived there, his palace was there, and also he had made houses or homes there, accommodations there, for those who were called his mighty men of valor. The mighty men of valor were the 37 who were regarded as his most elite fighting force. They're specifically identified and named elsewhere, and Uriah the Hittite was one of them. And so these homes were all in a fairly close proximity to each other. Though David had the nicest home on the block, there were other homes within easy walking distance of where David lived. All of these things were somewhat smaller scale than we might have thought at this time in history. And so David is now in a position where he can kind of scan the horizon and see this area where his home is the prominent one. It gives him a view of the homes of his so-called mighties that were in this area. And of course, Uriah's house was presumably not far from it, probably walking distance from David's own home. The home was probably built according to the Eastern style, which would be a horseshoe-shaped arrangement with an open courtyard out front. It wasn't uncommon to have a pool in that open courtyard. And so that's probably what Bathsheba is using at this point. It was designed so that you couldn't see that pool from the street. There was a kind of screen that would be set up to prevent, people just gawking at others as they're out there in the hot tub, as it were. But nevertheless, from a vantage point of some elevation, it was possible to see over and to see what was going on. It was considered impolite to walk up to your parapet and look out at all the people. That was a little bit rude, but David's the king, and so he's giving himself permission to do that. And as it turns out, he sees, of course, now a glimpse of this woman bathing. I don't think we assume that he saw, a complete nudity kind of deal, but it was just catching a glimpse at a distance, and it was enough to get his attention. So he sent and inquired about the woman. And someone said, well, isn't this Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite? He inquired about her, and once again, it's possible to think that he had no idea who she was, but the odds are against it. He knew the home of Uriah. Uriah was a close associate. All these 37 had close dealings with David. He'd probably met this woman in times past. The king would have social gatherings. These were people that were part of his inner group. They'd probably exchange pleasantries once or twice. Nothing untoward had ever happened between them. We have no reason to think that. But on the other hand, she might have had a bit of an infatuation with King David, his wonderful reputation and so on, and he probably had noticed her. We can assume that something like that might have been the case. The text doesn't say it. I'm not going to push the point too far, but I think we can at least, given the general kind of politics of the moment, assume that something like that was going on. But here David feigns into her. Who is that woman, feigning a little bit of ignorance about the matter. And so the response comes back, well, this is Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam. Now, you don't notice it at the moment, but if you trace that through, Eliam is the son of a man by the name of Ahithophel. Ahithophel, therefore, had a granddaughter named Bathsheba. Ahithophel also happens to be one of the two closest advisors to the king. The other one was a man by the name of Hushai. So you have Ahithophel and Hushai. One was said to be the king's counselor. The other was said to be the king's companion. These were kind of official capacities, but they also represented people who had ready access to David and who readily gave him counsel and guidance as he faced various decisions of state, that kind of thing. And so you can imagine that Ahithophel was not real happy when eventually it came to his attention that King David had essentially taken advantage of his granddaughter, whose name was Bathsheba. Later we're going to encounter this man again, because in the revolt mounted by Absalom, Ahithophel gives counsel to Absalom that would have destroyed David. He turns against David and sides with Absalom, and you have to believe the moment when that little breach of loyalty took place traces back to this. Hushai, on the other hand, remained favorable to David, sent him intel, underground information about what was going on, and a moment came with Absalom when he had to choose between the counsel of those two men. If he'd gone with Ahithophel, David would likely, by human reckoning at least, have been killed that very night. Hushai counseled for delay. Wait a minute, not so fast. Let's marshal a bigger army. And basically, Hushai buys time for David, which lets him really escape to safety. And Ahithophel probably adopted his hostile attitude toward David largely as a result of what happened right here. So we hear that she is the granddaughter of Ahithophel. We also hear that she is the wife of a man known as Uriah the Hittite. Interesting thing about this man, he has a Jewish name. Uriah is a Hebrew name, but he's denominated as a Hittite. Best guess is that he was of Hittite extraction, and probably his parents had moved to Israel as immigrants some years earlier. The Hittite Empire was a powerful and dominant empire back in the era of the Judges. But they had been largely dismantled through a kind of marauding waves of invaders over several different occasions over about 100 years or so. So the Hittite Empire was really not there anymore. Many of these people had simply distributed themselves around the ancient Near East. Some wound up in Israel. And probably the parents of this man had migrated to Israel, and they'd given their son a Jewish name because they now live here, and had probably actually proselyted in to the religion of Israel. But at the same time, he is known as a Hittite because he has that fairly recent connection to that ethnicity. So we think probably that's what's going on with him. Well, anyway, David sent messengers and took her, and she came to him. And he lay with her. And when cleansed from her impurity, she returned to her house. Commentators will very frequently note the allure of forbidden fruit. David is the king. At all times in history, people who are in high political office usually don't have a lot of trouble getting sexual favors if they want them. Just to be blunt, I think you know that. If that's true today, it was even more true way back when. David as the king didn't have any restrictions on his ability to bring into his harem attractive women in the kingdom. Now, we don't know exactly the numbers that added up to, but we know that he certainly had multiple wives and concubines. But there was something about this one who is off limits. Isn't it true? You know, forbidden fruit has a kind of allure that exceeds that which is legitimately accessible. The most famous story in church history, as far as I know on that, is Augustine, who as a young man stole some pears from a pear orchard that was down the street from his house. He laments that later in the Confessions. Not because stealing the pears was so bad in itself, although he thinks it was, but it was because he didn't want the pears. He didn't like pears. He threw the pears to the pigs. Who needs these lousy pears? The only reason he stole the pears was because it was so much fun to do something evil. As soon as I tell you or you tell me something is off limits, doesn't it become just a little bit more appealing? Isn't there something in this strange psyche of ours that we become fascinated with that which we can't quite get? And in the case of pears, it's bad enough, but when it happens to be something that is intrinsically attractive anyway, it just adds to the juice, doesn't it? And that's what David is dealing with. He could have anyone he wants, you might say, and yet this is the one he cannot have, and it becomes the one that he fixates on in some sense or other. One commentator said this is the appeal of forbidden fruit is a potent charm, and I think it got to David. So he took her. This is not to be understood as forcibly took her. He didn't send guys down and put her in cuffs, and drag her up. It wasn't anything like that. This was an official summons. That's really the sense of the word here. It's an invitation from the king, and I'm going to tell you, she could have declined it. Now, it's risky to decline an invitation from the king, but on the other hand, Bathsheba's a grown-up girl. She knows what's going on here. And so at this point, she has a little bit of complicity in this. I put by far most of the blame on David, but she could have said, oh, hold the phone, wait a minute. No, this doesn't make sense. I don't think so. And it would have been the end of it. Other women in David's life had stood their ground. Abigail comes to mind, She could have, she didn't. The summons came, and notably, the text includes, she came to him. And I think we can at least construe that to mean she came willingly, very likely knowingly. Again, I'm not trying to put all the blame on her. I hope you understand that. But at the same time, a little female courage here would have gone a long way to avert what turned out to be a very tragic situation. He lay with her. I'm always astonished at the restraint with which the Bible reports interesting details. No salacious conversation, no added little color to the whole thing to spice it up. It's just so prosaic. And that's kind of the way the Bible is. It argues to its truthfulness, that it doesn't embellish much. It's so truthful. Warts and all, there it is. Bottom line, this colossal compromise, not only of the law of God, but of David's own, self-restraint. All of these things are reflected in that little phrase. And she went home. Now, this has often confused people who read this business about cleansing herself from her impurity. The Hebrew is very trenchant and rather cryptic at this point, but I think by far the best understanding of it, which has been subscribed to by, I think, the best who've reviewed this, is that what it's saying is that under the Levitical law in Israel, sexual intercourse gave rise to what was called ritual uncleanness. The book of Leviticus has elaborate rules that govern what is clean, what is unclean, And it's all kinds of pedantic stuff that we look at from a distance and think, wow, that seems kind of strange. But at the time, it had its purpose. This is not to say that sexual intercourse between a husband and a wife was sinful, as some have tried to construe it, because even there it gave rise to this uncleanness. It was simply part of the elaborate rules of connecting various kinds of bodily functions and so on with what was called ritual uncleanness. There was a simple washing rite which was necessary to restore a state of ritual cleanliness after various incidents. You had contact with a dead body, for example. All kinds of things would give rise to this kind of temporary uncleanness. And so what she does is goes home and meticulously observes the Levitical code with respect to ritual uncleanness. It says to us something about the big elephant in the room that she's trying to wash away with a little bit of water, The great crime that's been committed. And she diligently does this, which of course doesn't get to the matter at all. You can't get rid of the uncleanness of what's happened by going through a little washing rite. I had a friend many years ago, this was back in the early 70s actually, who was a Christian. He'd been grown up in the home, kind of in the church. He kind of took leave of his faith for a time, went over to Seattle, wound up living in the Y. It wasn't a good time for him. And he was just kind of bouncing around pillar to post there. I talked to him sometime later, a couple of years later, about what had happened. And he said, at one point in this environment there in the Y, it wasn't very healthy. He actually, on one occasion, had an immoral kind of encounter with another man. And he'd never had anything like that before, nor since. And he said to me, after that, I went back to my room and I took a shower literally for 2 hours, trying to wash away the feeling. It didn't work, he said. And in many ways, that was the triggering event that eventually brought him back to a life of better faith. And he turned out being a person who was engaged in various Christian ministries throughout the succeeding years. It was kind of a turning point for him when he tried to, through a kind of ritual, get to his conscience. It doesn't work. That's not how you get to the conscience. A little bath doesn't do it. It seems that that's what Bathsheba was trying to do here. Great ceremonial precision, but it doesn't quite get to the heart of the matter. Well, she conceived, and so she sent and told David and said, I am with child. This isn't just interesting information. It was going to be evident soon enough that she had committed a capital crime. Her husband's away, and she began showing, how do you account for that? Uriah had the perfect right under Jewish law to prosecute her, and in that prosecution, she would be forced to answer the question under oath, who's the father? And she would finger David if she told the truth. And all of a sudden, David's exposed to a capital crime. And even the king in Israel was not above the law. And so when David saw that little piece of information, this was a colossal and catastrophic development for him, not to mention Bathsheba herself. Well, now we go into one of the most remarkable cover-up schemes known to the human race. And it starts when David sent to Joab saying, send me Uriah the Hittite. And Joab sent Uriah to David. When Uriah had come to him, David asked, how's Joab doing? How are the people doing? How's the war going? Uriah must have scratched his head, you know. Then David said to Uriah, go down to your house, wash your feet. And Uriah departed from the king's house, and a gift of food, a big basket you can imagine, a couple of bottles of wine, you know, and some good delicious fruit and everything that you'd want to have a nice enjoyable evening at home, followed him there. Here's Uriah, one of David's elite warriors. He's certainly acquainted with him. They've certainly had conversations before, but at this point Uriah had to be wondering just exactly why had David summoned him for this information. David tries flattery. Many people will fall prey to flattery, you know. The old expression, flattery will get you anywhere. I have to say I'm susceptible to that myself. And so David thought he could just kind of, you know, butter the guy up and have the ordinary course of events take place. Everything would be fine. Uriah, of course, doesn't succumb to this appeal. Uriah slept at the door of the king's house with all the servants of his lord and did not go down to his house. So when they told David saying Uriah didn't go down to his house, David said to Uriah, well, hey man, didn't you come from a long journey? Why didn't you go to your house? And Uriah said to David, the ark and Israel and Judah are dwelling in tents. My lord Joab and the servants of my lord are encamped in the open fields. Should I then go down to my house to eat and drink and to lie with my wife? As you and as your soul lives, I will not do this thing. There was a rule in Israel that an active service military man, when engaged in an actual conflict, was to keep himself from women. This again was because an active service guy out there fighting a battle was supposed to eliminate any distractions, stay focused on the goal, and thus anything that might represent some sort of the distraction from that goal was to be set aside for a time. Uriah, in solidarity with all the others who are out there, follows that rule. It applied to him. David's trying to get him to bend the rules. Come on, man, take a day off. Yeah. What's the harm? And he gives him this kind of appeal, hoping he'll get to his less disciplined sentiments here. But of course, Uriah maintained solidarity with the warriors, with the cause. But the very fact that the text mentions that Uriah threw into his response to David to go to his home and lie with my wife has suggested to many Uriah had a pretty good idea something was going on here more than meets the eye. That Uriah might suspect that something had happened in his absence. We don't know that. This is pure speculation. But again, it does at least suggest to a bright guy like Uriah that something suspicious is in the air here. Let alone the fact that Uriah, of course, slept that night in the guard room where the bodyguards of David, off duty, but there in the barracks that were provided for them, might have engaged in a little casual conversation. There might have been a little innuendo dropped along the way. You know how guys can be. And Uriah might even have had more reason to have some suspicions going on than he might otherwise have. Well, David, frustrated, said to Uriah, okay, remain here today. Tomorrow I'll send you back. So Uriah remained in Jerusalem that day. The next day, David invited him to eat and drink in his presence, and he made him drunk. And in the evening he went out to lie on his couch with his servants of the Lord, but he did not go down to his house. Flattery didn't work, maybe intoxication. Have another. What do you think? This is a great year. Try that one. Well, let's try this one over here. This is a great red. You can imagine Uriah. Now, I think he might have feigned a little bit more intoxication than was really the case, but sometimes intoxication lowers a person's, good judgment. We know that. But Uriah, to his credit, doesn't fall for it. He didn't go down to his house. He continued, in spite of a little wine, to observe the rule for warriors. And so David now, in frustration, goes to plan C and is going to co-opt the loyalty of Joab to become, as it were, almost complicit in this crime himself. So in the morning it happened that David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it by the hand of Uriah. Uriah must have wondered what's in that letter. Can you imagine? There's the king's seal, holding it up to the light. What is that? Taking the letter back. In the letter, David said to Joab, set Uriah in the forefront of the hottest battle and retreat from him, that he may be struck down and die. So it was while Joab besieged the city that he assigned Uriah to a place where he knew there would be valiant men. Joab knew something was wrong with this picture, because this is not due process. If Uriah had actually done something wrong, then he should be properly publicly accused of a crime. Israel had the most advanced system of due process known to the ancient world, bar none. I say that as a lawyer, There's no one that compared to the sense of due process that Israel had. And to say, put this guy out there where he's going to get struck in the battlefield and make sure he dies. Joab knew there was something very, very wrong with that picture. He's ferociously loyal to David, and so he carries this out, and in some ways he violates his own conscience by doing so. But Uriah, either way, is going to be the victim of that. The hottest battle referred to here would be the battle near the city gate. When a city was under siege, there might be very valiant warriors who would virtually go out of the city gates in what amounted in many cases to a suicide mission, trying to fight off the siege. They were going out against superior forces, but they were trying to sort of discourage the besiegers and hopefully get them to go home. So these valiant men come out. Typically, what you're supposed to do, if you're the besieger, is hold back. Stay at a safe distance. Lure these guys out as far as possible, and then do them in, It does at this point is considered very poor strategy. Send your men to meet these guys who have just come out of the city and push them back to the city gates, where those, your men, are going to be exposed, not simply to the fighting men that come out of the gate, but to the guys that are up there on the wall with bows and arrows, and other equipment like that. And so that's what Joab does. Then the men of the city came out and fought with Joab, and some of the people of the servants of David fell, and Uriah the Hittite died also. Then Joab sent and told David all the things concerning the war. The men came out as expected. Joab should have kept a safe distance. Instead, he chases them back. Uriah dies. He's the hero in this story. Dies an obedient man and suffers the consequences of bad acts by other people. Joab sent and told David, anticipating that David was probably in a somewhat mercurial state of mind. Something's going on. Joab doesn't necessarily know what it is, but David could be given to rather volatile reactions to things, and he thinks, here I might be caught holding the short end of the stick just for doing what David commanded, so he gives a rather elaborate explanation to go back to David through a messenger. When you finish telling the matters of the war to the king, if it happens that the king's wrath arises, and he says to you, why did you approach so near the city? Didn't you know they'd shoot from the wall? Don't you remember Abimelech, the son of Jerubbesheth? Wasn't it a woman who cast a piece of millstone on him and killed him so that he died at Tebez? Why did you go so near the wall? Joab can hear it, David's a bright guy. He's very likely to accuse Joab of some kind of very inappropriate military strategy, to which, of course, Joab says if he reacts in that way, then you remind David, your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead also. Just doing your bidding, sir. So, this incident, by the way, from the book of Judges was very famous because the man mentioned here, Abimelech, was a famous, very successful warrior, and he was killed by a woman throwing a good-sized rock off the wall, and so it sort of stood proverbially in Israel for guys who can be taken in by unexpected enemies, and so you always got to be on your guard. That sort of thing was what was going on here. Well, the messenger went and came and told David all that Joab had said. And the messenger said to David, surely the men prevailed against us. We came out in the open field, drove them back as far as the city gate, just as expected, as advertised. These guys came out. The archers shot from the wall. Some of the king's servants are dead. Your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead also. Then David said to the messenger, okay, say this to Joab. Don't worry about it. Not to worry. The sword devours one as well as another. Strengthen your attack against the city. Overthrow it, and so encourage Joab. Don't beat yourself up, Joab. And then David has a rather cynical philosophy of war. First time we've ever heard it. The sword devours one as well as another. If you're trying to deflect blame from bad actors, blame the instruments. Blame those lousy swords. I'm telling you, if there weren't so many swords around, don't you get tired of sword violence out there all the time? And that's exactly where David goes with this. It's those swords. Blame them. One commentator, speaking some years back, of the hazards of the machine age, as he called it. He said, the hazards of the machine age are not to be blamed for the death of an innocent child under the wheels of a car driven by a drunk driver. Those lousy cars, I'm telling you, don't you get tired? We should do something about those cars. Well, we are trying. We're trying to do these braking systems. Maybe that'll help. But you get the point, don't you? It's so easy to deflect blame. It's not your fault, Joab. It's the sword's fault. Oh, by the way, it's not David's fault either. It's those swords. We just got to get control of them. The sword devours one as well as another. Don't take it to heart. When the wife of Uriah heard that Uriah, her husband, was dead, she mourned for her husband. I bet she did. because, of course, she knew that she was part of what had brought about his death. She knew that. And I'm sure she loved her husband in that moment of caving in to the attacks, as it were, the seduction of this man that she admired. Didn't change the fact that she loved her husband. And now to have him dead, and for her to be at fault, at least partly for that, must have given her great grief. She mourned for her husband. I'm sure she mourned for herself. But when the mourning was over, David sent and brought her to his house, and she became his wife and bore him a son. But the thing that David had done displeased the Lord. It might seem a little precipitous. A period of mourning would last about 30 days, and then for David to marry her immediately. But actually in the ancient Near East, it wasn't that uncommon. So that in itself wouldn't necessarily have raised people's suspicions. But of course, anybody who was good at arithmetic would have figured out something else was going on here, in terms of her immediate pregnancy and the birth of a child a few months later. David was hoping to conceal the crime. A son was eventually born, a son who would soon die, and we'll be looking at that soon enough. Something else happened, of course, at this juncture. David, who's living with his wives, with his concubines, with his children, with the staff that served him in the home, all became acutely aware of what had happened. This was no secret to them. And David, of course, lost precipitously the moral high ground with his family. Many commentators believe, suspect, and the arithmetic seems to work, that the incident involving Amnon and Tamar, two half-siblings in David's family, that took place during these months, before Nathan confronted David, but after these things came to be known. We'll explore that maybe a little bit more at a different time. One way or another, David thought he had fixed everything, but he hadn't quite fixed his conscience. He hadn't quite fixed the breach of his integrity before the Lord. And all of it was displeasing to God. There's going to be some months pass before Nathan shows up, but we'll be looking at that next week. For now, I'm out of time, but I want to quickly give you this thought at the end of our discussion here. Sunday School Lesson Point 1, every Christian needs a strategy for temptation avoidance to guard against a moment when temptation resistance becomes impossible. We all, regardless of age, regardless of anything, are susceptible to temptation. It may look something like David's, it may not. Temptation comes in different forms to different people, but as the writer to the Hebrews says, we need to set aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us, and run with endurance the race set before us. The strategy of a faithful Christian is not to see how close to temptation can I get and still maintain my willpower. That's a bad strategy, Temptation avoidance, not temptation resistance, is really the proper way to approach these matters. And David, of course, probably thought he could resist temptation, but discovered much to his grief he was not able to do so. Second, every Christian needs to understand there's never a day off from discipleship, but each day is a day of pressing toward the mark. We all enjoy days off. I like being retired. Every day's a day off. I love it. But there's a movie, I never saw it, but it was called Ferris Bueller's Day Off. I've always suspected some really strange things happened on that day. I've never seen the movie, but maybe some of you have. But it just suggests to me we should always be on our guard against the temptation of letting our guard down on a day off, I think David took a day off, and he was regretting it for days and years to come. Finally, every Christian needs to believe that without Christ we are helpless, but with Christ we can do all things. Our strength comes from Christ. It doesn't come from mustering up some great head of steam to keep the temptations in life from grabbing a hold of me. We go to Christ first, and by so doing we, of course, invoke the greatest protection we possibly could against the Bathsheba situations that may come along in life.